So we all know we're supposed to be taking notes in all of our classes in order to maximize our learning and performance, and yet it feels like there's so little explicit instruction on the best way to do that. So today we're going to turn that around and dive into a simple 3-step system we can use to ensure our notes not only maximize our learning, but also help us be more productive come study time. So here we have our strategy card all on rethinking the way we take class notes. But before we dive into this structure, I'm going to go ahead and go over some of the pitfalls that I see students fall into and see if you've fallen into any of these yourself. So the first struggle I see is the student who doesn't write anything. And it's maybe because they don't go to lecture, but typically that's not the case. Usually it's because the professor is already providing all of the lecture slides. And so it makes sense from a student's perspective to say, why would I write anything down when I have literally a perfect transcript of everything they're going to cover anyways? And I've fallen into that trap many times myself, but we're going to learn in just a minute why that's actually not the best way to go. The second common pitfall that I see is the student that isn't sure exactly what they should be writing in their notes. How do you know what's important when there's so many things being thrown at you constantly? So then what happens is you leave lecture and you go to study or do your homework and you realize, I don't actually have anything in my notes that I needed. And so what was I doing? Why did I waste my time? And then the final common trap that I see students fall into is they do almost the polar opposite of the first issue, and they write down everything that's covered in class. They're writing down word for word what the professor is saying, and then they leave class with this perfect transcript of lecture. And ironically, research shows that the more you tend to write in your notes, the less likely you are to go back to them in the future. So that's also not the right way to go. So let's learn the better way for us to do this. Now, in order to put ourselves in the right mindset for this system, it's important that we recognize that better notes are a result of us becoming more active participants in class. You see, contrary to common belief, we don't learn through osmosis. We can't just show up in lecture, write a few things down, or in some people's case, write too many things down, and then expect to actually learn. Instead, we want to free up our brain to do what it does best and to think and to problem solve and to be critical in class. But we can't do that if we're so focused on note-taking. So how are we going to free up that space and then instead take notes that are just a written expression of what was actually happening in our brain? Well, we're going to do these 3 things. So the first strategy that we're going to follow is all about becoming a big picture thinker. So many students, myself included, we get caught up in tiny details in lecture. We want to be sure we're capturing down everyone's name just right, or the dates just right, or the formulas just right. But realize that we can always turn back to the textbook. We can always turn back to Google or AI to fill in tiny little details. And if we can free ourselves of focusing on tiny little details, then that's going to allow us to really pay attention to what the professor is saying. And we're considering things like, what's the point of all of this? What's the main idea? What's the big picture here? Do I notice any major themes? Do I see any connections between what's being covered right now and what I saw in the textbook or what we covered in the last class or on the last exam? And then once I've done that thinking, can I translate it into my own words in real time? So I'm not getting caught up in those details. And this now becomes a record of what was happening in your brain. And these are the things that are impossible to capture. We can always look stuff up, but we can't remember the questions that we had in lecture. We can't remember when we felt extra confused or when we had a breakthrough, when we had an aha moment, like things just finally clicked together. Those are definitely the things we want to capture in our notes, but it requires that we're comfortable focusing on the big picture and not the tiny details. The second thing that we want to do in our notes to make them more effective is to start getting visual. Now, as much as I would love for all of us to be these amazing artists who create these beautifully aesthetic notes, that's not the case. That's not the real world for most of us. However, we can all make our notes more visual. And in fact, learning science shows in something called dual coding theory that wherever we can incorporate visuals into our notes, learning is more solidified in our brain. Now, this doesn't have to be tough. This might be something like drawing arrows to show connection between things. This might be circling things that can be grouped together to show connection. This could be even just where we place things on a page. Things that are related to each other should go next to each other. Now, in order to do this, I am going to urge you to free yourself from the lines or the grid on your paper. Now, in some courses, yes, grids are very valuable, especially in things like math courses or chemistry. However, for a lot of the notes that we take, we should allow ourselves to become just a little bit looser. And this is a much better representation of how our brain actually processes knowledge. It's not very linear. That outline style of taking notes is really not representative of how our brains are learning. So instead, free yourself. Start drawing these arrows. Draw simple graphs and diagrams, group things together to show process and connection. And it's going to allow you to become a better, bigger picture thinker at the same time, which is a nice little added bonus. I would also like to give you a little pro tip here, which is to leave white space in your notes. So the best students understand that notes are not finished when we leave lecture. In fact, in a lot of ways, they're only just beginning. So we're going to do ourselves a favor and leave space. So remember, I told you that big picture thinkers don't focus on tiny details. Well, tiny details are important, and we do need to capture those things. So that means we need to leave space in our notes so we can return to those things after class when we can just look them up. And so if we don't have white space, what happens is our notes get very messy very quickly. And if we also don't have white space in our notes, then as we do suddenly have connections, let's say you've already moved on further in a topic, and then you realize, oh, that's what they meant. We can go back to that section of our notes and fill it in because we've left white space for ourselves. And then the final thing that we are going to do here is we're going to pay attention to signals. So there are lots of strategies we can use to cue us into the things we should actually be writing, things like reading our textbook before class. However, we also need to pay attention to the way our professor delivers information. Our professors often will change their tone, change their personality almost when they're sharing certain things that are more important or less important. And so if suddenly you notice that your professor becomes much slower paced, much more intentional, that's a great indication to us that we should perk up and listen. And then once we gather what they have to say, use some of those big picture thinking skills, and then write that down into our notes, ideally in a visual way. And if they start speaking much more quickly because they're really excited about something and maybe it gets very fast and higher pitched, then that's probably something very important for us to pay attention to as well. And if they're sharing any things like applications, practice problems, or they pose a discussion question or a real world example, these things typically are their own knowledge, their own experience, and you're likely not going to find that in your textbook or by searching on Google. So definitely capture those things down. And then finally, when they say something like, this is key, or this may or may not be on a quiz pretty soon, please write that down. That is like red flag. They're letting you know that this is important for us to have. So now that we know these 3 simple steps that we can do to make sure that our notes are more usable for ourselves, what is the challenge? I always want to leave us with a challenge. My challenge for you is that you are going to, in your next lecture, handwrite. I'm going to underline that because this is important. That's me making this more visual for you. We're going to handwrite messy, and I'm going to put that in all caps. That's me making it visual for you. Notes. Why handwrite? Well, because research shows that students who handwrite outperform their peers who are typing, or the peers who don't take notes whatsoever. There is just something about getting physical and tactile with our learning that increases our retention. And also it helps us avoid the traps of things like not being visual or writing too much down. When you're typing on a laptop, you can type really quickly. And those are reasons we should not be using that. And instead, we're going to want to handwrite our notes. And then we want them to be messy. Messy is good. Why? Because learning is messy. This is exactly what's happening in your brain. I think that we are all ruined by those beautiful aesthetic notes that we see on social media. We love the look of those things. Great, we can do those later. We can do those after class as we're refining our notes. But for now, we want them to be messy. And that's okay, because learning should be. And then finally, we are taking notes. If you're not already taking notes, we're going to start doing that. And I promise that following the system is going to result in all of us having much better, smarter, more usable, and time-saving notes in the future.